When Eli Warren finds his mother unconscious, he calls 911 for help. But because of where they live, no one comes. Desperate and out of options, Eli takes a bold risk to save her life, sparking a series of events that would not only change his family's future, but shake the entire city. This is a story of courage, resilience, and the fight against injustice. Will Eli's actions be enough to save his mom and expose the system's failures? Watch to find out what happens next. Don't forget to subscribe and leave a comment. Tell us where you're watching from and how you would have handled Eli's situation. Your voice matters, and together we can keep these powerful stories alive. Now, let's begin. Eli Warren slung his backpack over his shoulder, the weight pulling him slightly to one side as he adjusted the straps. He was small for his age, and the oversized bag filled with school books and papers made him feel even smaller. He didn't mind, though. Eli was used to things being a little heavy, a little harder than they seemed for other kids. He kicked a pebble along the sidewalk as he walked the last block home, humming to himself as the dim autumn light bathed the street in gold. He turned the corner to his apartment building, a tired old structure that loomed against the backdrop of the evening sky. Its red bricks had long since faded to a dull brown, and the fire escape rattled with the slightest breeze. Eli looked up at the second floor where his apartment sat. Even though the building was falling apart, it was still home. He gripped the plastic bag in his hand, filled with apples and a loaf of bread that his mom had asked him to pick up on his way back from school. His stomach growled as he thought of the soup his mother had promised to make for dinner. She'd been feeling tired lately, more tired than usual, but she always found a way to make sure he had something warm to eat when he got home. As Eli reached the rusty front door of the apartment building, he paused, taking in the familiar smell of damp and mildew. The security gate was still broken. It had been for as long as he could remember. The elevator had stopped working a year ago, too, which meant he had to take the stairs. Eli didn't mind that, though. It gave him a chance to think, to reflect on the day. The halls were quiet except for the distant sound of a TV blaring in one of the neighboring apartments. He took the stairs 2 at a time, eager to get home and see his mom. She was due any day now, and Eli couldn't wait to meet his new baby brother or sister. He grinned at the thought of having someone to play with, someone who would share the apartment with him. As he climbed the steps, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. His mom had seemed more tired than usual this morning, and even though she had smiled and told him everything was fine, Eli knew she was just trying to keep him from worrying. The second floor smelled like cigarette smoke and overcooked meat, the usual blend of scents that hung in the air of their building. The light bulb in the hallway flickered as Eli made his way to apartment 2B, the plastic bag swinging at his side. He passed Miss Janet's door, hearing the muffled sound of a soap opera playing on her TV. She was nice, always giving him a smile whenever she saw him in the hallway. Eli paused, wondering if she might come out and say hello, but the door stayed closed. When he reached his own door, Eli noticed something strange. The door was slightly ajar. His heart skipped a beat. That wasn't right. His mom always kept the door locked, especially in this neighborhood, where things sometimes went missing if you weren't careful. He pushed the door open cautiously, stepping inside the small apartment. His mom usually greeted him the moment he walked in, her voice warm and comforting after a long day at school. "Mom?" Eli called out. No answer. He dropped the plastic bag on the kitchen counter and stepped further into the apartment. The living room was empty, the couch untouched. A small sigh of relief escaped his lips. Maybe she was just in the bathroom. He was probably worrying over nothing. But as he moved toward the kitchen, his stomach twisted into knots. The pot on the stove was boiling over, steam rising and hissing as it hit the burner. The soup was still cooking, but his mom wasn't there. "Mom!" he shouted, louder this time. And that's when he saw her. Rachel Warren was lying on the kitchen floor, her body motionless, her face pale. For a moment, Eli's entire world froze. The only sound he could hear was the pounding of his own heartbeat in his ears. His legs felt like they had turned to stone, his breath caught in his throat. He ran to her, dropping to his knees beside her still form. "Mom!" he cried, his voice trembling. She didn't respond. Her chest rose and fell in shallow, uneven breaths, but she didn't move. Tears burned at the edges of Eli's eyes, but he blinked them away. He didn't have time to cry. He had to do something. He had to help her. His hands shook as he touched her face. It was cold, clammy. Eli's mind raced. What was he supposed to do? What was the right thing? His teacher had taught them first aid last month, but he had never imagined he would have to use it on his own mother. He gently tilted her head back, trying to make sure her airway was clear, just like they had taught in class. Her breathing was faint, but it was still there. He pressed his hands together, trying to remember the steps from class. "Stay with me, Mom," he whispered, his voice shaking. "Please." Eli rushed to the counter, searching for his mom's cell phone. It wasn't where she usually kept it. His hands fumbled through the clutter on the kitchen table. Old bills, grocery receipts, a few pens. Panic surged through him as he pushed everything aside. Then he remembered. Her phone was charging in the bedroom. He bolted down the hallway to their small shared room, grabbing the phone off the nightstand. His fingers trembled as he dialed 911, the sound of the phone ringing seeming to stretch on forever. 911, what's your emergency? A calm, detached voice answered on the other end of the line. Eli's words tumbled out in a rush. "It's my mom! She's unconscious. She's pregnant, and she's not breathing right. Please, I need help." There was a pause, and then the operator's voice softened. "What's your location, sweetie?" 2312. "Willow Street, apartment 2B, Eli said, his voice cracking. "Please hurry!" Another pause, longer this time. 23 on 12 Willow Street. That's on the east side, right? "Yes," Eli said, nodding frantically, even though the operator couldn't see him. "Please, we need help right now." The operator sighed audibly, and her tone shifted, growing colder. "Honey, I need to ask you something. Is there any history of drugs or alcohol in the house?" Eli blinked, confusion washing over him. No, she's just sick. She needs help." "I see," the operator said, her voice still detached. "Well, calls from that area can take a little longer. We prioritize the most urgent cases and—" "This is urgent!" Eli shouted, his heart pounding in his chest. "She's not breathing right, and she's pregnant. Please, someone has to come." "I understand, sweetie," the operator said, her voice almost condescending. "But in neighborhoods like that, people need to learn how to handle things themselves. We'll send someone as soon as we can." Eli stared at the phone in disbelief as the line went dead. The phone slipped from his hand and fell to the floor with a soft thud. His stomach churned with a mix of fear and anger. How could they just hang up? How could they leave his mom like this? Eli's heart pounded as he stared at his mother lying still on the kitchen floor. He knelt beside her, holding her cold hand, trying to keep calm. But the operator's voice echoed in his mind. People need to learn how to handle things themselves. What did that even mean? His mom was sick. How could they ignore that? Eli swallowed back the frustration bubbling in his throat and tried to focus. He had to think of something else. If the ambulance wasn't coming right away, he couldn't just sit there and do nothing. "Mom," he whispered, squeezing her hand gently. "Please wake up." He rose to his feet, his legs trembling as he took a deep breath. He needed help, and he couldn't wait any longer for it. He rushed to the apartment door, throwing it open, and bolted down the hallway. He knew where to go first. Miss Janet, his mom's friend, and their neighbor. She had always been kind to them, and maybe, just maybe, she could help get someone here faster. Miss Janet's apartment was only a few doors down. Eli banged on the door with both fists, his small body shaking with urgency. "Miss Janet," he shouted. "Please help." "It's my mom." For a moment, there was no answer. Eli's heart raced faster, and he pounded on the door again. Finally, the door opened, and Miss Janet appeared. She was in her 50s, with gray streaks in her curly hair and soft, tired eyes. Her expression immediately changed when she saw Eli's tear-streaked face. "What's wrong, baby?" she asked, her voice full of concern. "It's my mom," Eli gasped, struggling to catch his breath. "She's on the floor. She's not breathing right. I called 911, but they're not coming. They said it would take a while because of where we live." Miss Janet's face hardened. "They said that?" she asked, disbelief tinging her voice. She reached out, placing a reassuring hand on Eli's shoulder. Don't worry, sweetie. I'll call them again. Eli followed her into her apartment, his heart still racing. Miss Janet picked up her old landline phone and dialed 911, her fingers moving quickly across the worn buttons. Eli listened intently, every muscle in his body tense as he waited for the operator to answer. 911, what's your emergency? The voice on the other end was different this time, but the tone was the same. Calm, detached. Yes, this is Janet Howard from 2312 Willow Street, Miss Janet said firmly. We need an ambulance immediately. My neighbor, Rachel Warren, is unconscious. She's pregnant, and her son says she's not breathing properly. There was a pause, and Eli's heart sank as he recognized the same hesitation from before. He watched Miss Janet's face closely, hoping against hope that this call would be different. But then Miss Janet's expression changed, her lips tightening into a thin line. What do you mean it'll take a while? She asked, her voice rising. This is an emergency. You can't just leave them like that. Eli's chest tightened. He knew what the answer would be before she even hung up the phone. Miss Janet placed the receiver back in its cradle with a heavy sigh, shaking her head. They said the same thing, she muttered, frustration clear in her voice. It'll be a while. Eli felt his legs give out beneath him, and he collapsed onto the old sofa in Miss Janet's living room. How could this be happening? How could they just ignore his mom like that? She was in danger, and no one seemed to care. Miss Janet knelt down in front of him, her eyes full of sympathy. I'm so sorry, Eli, she said softly. But don't you worry. We're going to figure something out. Stay with your mom. I'm going to try to get more help. Eli nodded, swallowing the lump in his throat as he wiped at his eyes with the back of his sleeve. He couldn't afford to cry right now. He had to be strong for his mom. Eli rushed back to his apartment, his heart pounding in his chest. When he got inside, his mom was still lying on the floor, her breathing faint and shallow. He knelt beside her again, taking her hand in his, feeling the coldness of her skin. His mind was racing. He needed to do something, but he didn't know what else to try. A few minutes later, there was a knock at the door. Eli's head shot up, hope flickering inside him for the first time since this nightmare began. He ran to the door and opened it to find Mr. Anderson, one of the neighbors from down the hall. He was an older man with a gruff voice but a kind heart, and he had always looked out for Eli and his mom. I heard Janet talking to some folks outside, Mr. Anderson said, stepping into the apartment. She told me what's going on. I figured I'd come see what I could do. Eli blinked up at him, his throat tight with emotion. The ambulance. It's not coming, he whispered. They said it'll take a while because of where we live. Mr. Anderson's jaw clenched. That's not right, he muttered, shaking his head. They can't just leave you like this. Behind him, more footsteps echoed in the hallway. Jessica Hill, a teenager who lived in the building, appeared in the doorway, followed by a few other neighbors. Their faces were filled with worry as they gathered in the small apartment, looking down at Eli and his mom. What's going on? Jessica asked, her voice soft but tense. We heard Miss Janet talking. Is your mom okay? Eli shook his head, his voice trembling. She's unconscious, and the ambulance won't come fast enough. The room fell silent for a moment as everyone processed what Eli had said. Then, one by one, the neighbors began to speak up. We need to do something, Mr. Anderson said firmly. We can't just stand around waiting. Jessica nodded, pulling out her phone. I'll call again. Maybe if we all call, they'll have to come. The others followed suit, dialing 911 one by one. Eli listened as they all spoke to the operators, explaining the situation with increasing frustration. But each time, the response was the same. The ambulances were delayed, and there was nothing they could do. Eli's heart sank deeper with every call, the weight of helplessness pressing down on him. He was just a kid. How could he possibly save his mom when even the adults couldn't? But then, as Eli sat there watching his neighbor's fruitless attempts to get help, an idea sparked in his mind. It wasn't perfect, but it was something. He couldn't just sit there and wait any longer. He stood up, his legs still trembling, and faced the room full of worried faces. I'm going to try something else, he said, his voice barely more than a whisper. I'm going to call again, but this time, I'm going to tell them we're in a different neighborhood. A murmur of surprise rippled through the group. Miss Janet shook her head slowly. Eli, honey, you can't lie to them, she said softly. That could get you into trouble. Eli's fists clenched at his sides. But they're not coming, he said, his voice breaking. If I tell them we're somewhere else, somewhere they care about, maybe they'll come faster. By the time they figure it out, they'll already be here, and then they'll have to help. The adults exchanged worried glances, but none of them argued. Deep down, they all knew he was right. The system was broken, and if Eli didn't take action, his mom might not make it. Miss Janet sighed, sadness flickering in her eyes. It's risky, she said quietly, but we don't have many options left. Eli nodded, steeling himself for what he was about to do. He grabbed the phone from the couch and walked into the hallway, his hands shaking as he dialed 911 once more. The phone rang, and his heart pounded in his chest as he waited. 911, what's your emergency? This time, it was a man's voice on the other end. Calm, professional, but distant, just like the others. Eli took a deep breath, forcing his voice to stay steady. It's my mom, he said. She's unconscious, and she's pregnant. Please, we need an ambulance right away. All right, the operator said. Where are you located? Eli's pulse quickened. This was it, the moment of truth. He had to make this work. We're at 425 Oakwood Avenue, he said, naming a street in a wealthier part of town where he knew emergency services responded quickly. Apartment 3B? There was a pause on the other end of the line, and Eli held his breath, praying that the lie would work. His heart hammered in his chest. Eli waited, his heart hammering in his chest, as the silence on the other end of the phone stretched on. He could hear the faint sound of the operator typing, his breath catching in his throat. He squeezed the phone tighter, desperate for a response, desperate for the lie to work. All right, the operator finally said, his voice still calm and professional. We'll dispatch an ambulance to 425 Oakwood Avenue, apartment 3B. Stay on the line, and we'll keep you updated. A wave of relief washed over Eli, so strong that his knees nearly gave out beneath him. It had worked. Help was coming. Thank you, Eli whispered, barely able to get the words out, as tears of both relief and fear welled in his eyes. Please, hurry! We'll be there as soon as possible, the operator said. Just stay with your mother until help arrives. Eli hung up the phone, his body trembling with the weight of everything that had happened. He leaned against the wall in the dimly lit hallway, closing his eyes for a moment. He had done it. He had gotten them to send an ambulance. But as the relief washed over him, a new worry began to creep in. What if they figured out he had lied? What if they didn't come after all? He pushed those thoughts aside, focusing instead on his mom. He had done what he needed to do. Now he just had to wait for the help to arrive. Eli returned to his apartment, his body tense as he knelt beside his mother once again. She hadn't moved, and her breathing was still shallow, but she was holding on. Eli took her cold hand in his and squeezed gently. Help's coming, Mom, he whispered, though he wasn't sure if she could hear him. They're coming now. His eyes flickered to the clock on the wall. Every second that ticked by felt like an eternity. Eli tried to keep calm, tried to stay focused, but the weight of the situation pressed down on him. He couldn't shake the fear that time was running out. As the minutes dragged on, more neighbors gathered outside the apartment door. They whispered among themselves, casting worried glances at Eli and his mother. Miss Janet hovered nearby, her brow furrowed with concern. Mr. Anderson stood with his arms crossed, pacing back and forth, while Jessica sat on the edge of the couch, staring down at her phone. They should have been here by now, Jessica muttered, frustration clear in her voice. It's been too long. Eli's stomach twisted with fear. He didn't want to believe it, but deep down, he knew she was right. The ambulance should have arrived by now. Had something gone wrong? He stood up abruptly, his legs shaky as he paced toward the window. He stared out at the street below, watching for any sign of flashing lights, any sign that help was finally coming. But the street was quiet, empty except for a few cars parked along the curb. They'll be here, Eli said, his voice trembling as he tried to convince himself as much as the others. They have to be. Suddenly, the sound of a phone buzzing jolted Eli from his thoughts. He turned toward Jessica, who was staring down at her phone, her eyes wide with surprise. "Eli," she said, her voice urgent. "The video, it's spreading. People are starting to share it." Eli blinked, his mind struggling to catch up. "What do you mean?" Jessica turned the phone around, showing him the screen. It was the video they had recorded earlier, the one that showed his mom lying unconscious on the floor, with the neighbors' desperate pleas for help in the background. It had been posted on social media, and now it was being shared by more and more people. The comments were filled with outrage, with strangers demanding answers as to why no one had come to help. "Look," Jessica said, scrolling through the comments. "People are tagging the city, the news stations. They're demanding an ambulance." Eli's heart raced as he read the messages. He couldn't believe it. People were listening. People who didn't even know him or his mom were standing up for them, calling for justice. He felt a small spark of hope flicker inside him. But then his gaze shifted back to his mother, lying so still on the floor, and the hope wavered. The video was spreading, but would it be enough? Would it get them help before it was too late? It felt like hours had passed, though in reality, it had only been about 20 minutes since Eli had called 911 with the false address. He paced back and forth, his anxiety growing with every second. The other neighbors tried to reassure him, but the tension in the room was palpable. Just when Eli was beginning to lose hope, the sound of sirens filled the air. His heart leapt in his chest as he ran to the window, looking down at the street below. A bright red ambulance was pulling up to the curb, its lights flashing. "They're here!" Eli shouted, relief surging through him. The neighbors quickly stepped aside as Eli rushed to the door and flung it open. Two paramedics climbed out of the ambulance, hurrying up the steps to the apartment. Eli felt a wave of emotion crash over him as they entered the room, their faces serious and focused. But before Eli could fully relax, he noticed something else. Two police officers were following the paramedics inside. Eli's stomach twisted with unease. He hadn't expected the police to show up. Why were they here? The paramedics knelt beside Rachel, quickly assessing her condition. One of them, a woman with short brown hair, spoke calmly as she worked. "We need to get her stabilized and on a stretcher." Eli watched anxiously, his heart in his throat. But even as the paramedics worked to help his mom, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The two police officers stood off to the side, their arms crossed, watching everything closely. One of them, a tall man with a square jaw and stern eyes, seemed to be scanning the room with suspicion. Finally, the taller officer stepped forward, his voice cold and commanding. "What happened here?" he asked, looking directly at Eli. Eli blinked, caught off guard by the question. She passed out," he stammered. "She's pregnant, and she wasn't feeling well. I called for help." The officer narrowed his eyes, clearly not satisfied with the answer. "And there's nothing else going on here?" he asked, his tone sharp. "No drugs, no alcohol?" Eli's stomach twisted with anger and disgust. How could he even ask that? His mom wasn't like that. She was sick, and she needed help. "No," Eli said, his voice trembling with frustration. "She's not on drugs. She's just sick." The officer glanced around the apartment, his gaze lingering on the worn furniture and cracked walls. His expression hardened, and Eli could see the judgment in his eyes. "We'll see about that," the officer muttered under his breath, though loud enough for everyone to hear. The tension in the room grew heavier as the police officers continued to watch the paramedics work. The paramedic with the short brown hair placed an oxygen mask over Rachel's face, her movements quick and efficient. Eli felt a small sense of relief as he saw his mom's breathing steady, even though she was still unconscious. But the relief was short-lived. The taller officer, the one who had questioned Eli earlier, stepped forward again, his arms crossed over his chest. His cold eyes swept over the room, lingering on every crack and flaw in the apartment. "What's really going on here?" the officer asked, his voice low and accusing. "This doesn't look like just a medical emergency." Eli's heart skipped a beat. What was he talking about? He had already told them what had happened. His mom had passed out, and she needed help. Why didn't they believe him? Mr. Anderson, who had been standing quietly by the door, stepped forward. "We've told you already," he said, his voice calm but firm. "The boy's mother is pregnant, and she's been unwell for days. She collapsed, and no one was coming to help. That's all there is to it." The officer snorted, his eyes narrowing. "Funny how that story is always the same in places like this," he muttered, though his voice was loud enough for everyone to hear. "Collapsed, sick, needing help. Next thing we know, we're finding drugs or booze in the mix." Eli clenched his fists, his entire body shaking with anger. How could they think that? How could they look at his mom, lying there unconscious, and still think she was just another addict or troublemaker? Miss Janet, who had been standing nearby, crossed her arms. "You've got a lot of nerve," she said, her voice sharp. "This woman is sick, and her son has been trying to get help for hours. Instead of throwing around accusations, maybe you should be focusing on getting her to the hospital." The officer's jaw tightened, but before he could respond, the younger officer beside him spoke up. His tone was slightly more measured, though still distant. "We're just doing our job, ma'am," he said, though his voice lacked conviction. "We've seen a lot of things in neighborhoods like this, and sometimes it's not what it seems." Eli couldn't believe what he was hearing. They were supposed to protect people, to help them when they were in trouble. But instead, they were treating his mom like she didn't deserve to be saved. Like they were already assuming the worst about her because of where they lived. Eli had had enough. He couldn't just stand by while these officers treated his mom like a criminal. His hands were still trembling, but he stood up straighter, meeting the taller officer's cold gaze. "She's not like that," Eli said, his voice shaking with emotion. "My mom's not on drugs. She's not drinking. She's a good person. She's just sick. Please, just help her." The paramedics continued working in the background, their faces focused as they prepared Rachel for transport. But the tension between Eli and the officers was thick, almost suffocating. The taller officer stepped closer to Eli, towering over him. His cold eyes bore into Eli's, full of skepticism and judgment. "You sure about that, kid?" he asked, his voice dripping with doubt. "You really expect us to believe there's nothing else going on here? No trouble?" Eli's stomach churned with frustration and anger. How could they be so heartless? His mom was lying there, barely breathing, and all they could think about was trying to prove that he and his family were guilty of something. "I'm not lying," Eli said, his voice trembling but resolute. "We've been waiting for help all night and no one came. My mom is sick and pregnant. That's all there is to it." The officer didn't respond, but his expression made it clear that he didn't believe Eli. He looked like he was about to say something else when one of the paramedics stood up from where he had been kneeling beside Rachel. "We need to move her to the ambulance now," the paramedic said, her tone professional but tense. "Her condition is critical. We can't wait any longer." The officers exchanged glances, but finally they seemed to back off. Eli let out a breath he didn't realize he had been holding as the paramedics quickly and carefully lifted his mother onto a stretcher. As the paramedics wheeled Rachel out of the apartment, Eli followed close behind, his heart pounding in his chest. The flashing lights of the ambulance illuminated the dark street outside, casting long shadows across the buildings. The night air was cool against Eli's face, but the tension in his chest kept his body feeling warm with nervous energy. The paramedics lifted his mom into the back of the ambulance, securing her to the stretcher as they worked quickly. One of them, a woman with short brown hair, motioned for Eli to climb inside. "Come on, kid," she said, her voice firm but not unkind. "You can ride with us." Eli nodded, his legs trembling as he climbed into the ambulance. The inside smelled of disinfectant and plastic, and the harsh fluorescent lights made everything seem colder. Eli settled into a seat next to his mother, watching as the paramedics checked her vitals and adjusted her oxygen mask. "Is she going to be okay?" Eli asked, his voice small, almost a whisper. The paramedic glanced at him, her face unreadable. "We're going to do everything we can," she said, her tone steady but non-committal. "She's in good hands." Eli swallowed hard, his fingers gripping the edge of the seat as the ambulance doors slammed shut behind him. The sound of the siren blared to life, and the ambulance sped off into the night, racing toward the hospital. Eli's heart raced along with it, his mind spinning with a mix of fear and desperation. His mom was still unconscious, her breathing shallow, but at least now she was getting help. But even as the ambulance rushed down the empty streets, Eli couldn't shake the fear that something terrible might still happen. He couldn't lose her, not like this. He glanced out the window, watching the city lights blur past, feeling the weight of everything that had happened pressing down on him. The paramedics were doing their best, but Eli knew that his fight wasn't over yet. His mom was on her way to the hospital, but the road ahead still felt uncertain. And the words of the police officer back at the apartment, those cold, skeptical words, echoed in his mind, making his stomach twist with dread. "Don't think we're done here." The ambulance pulled up to the emergency entrance of the hospital, the siren's wail fading into the night as the paramedics quickly unloaded Rachel. Eli followed them closely as they wheeled her inside, his heart pounding in his ears as the doors to the hospital slid open. The emergency room was a blur of activity. Nurses and doctors moved quickly, their faces focused and serious. The fluorescent lights overhead cast everything in a sterile glow, and the sound of beeping machines and hurried footsteps filled the air. Eli felt small and out of place, but he couldn't leave his mom's side. The paramedics handed her off to the hospital staff, and soon Rachel was being whisked away into a nearby treatment room. Eli tried to follow, but a nurse stopped him, gently placing her hand on his shoulder. "Wait here, sweetie," the nurse said softly. "We need to check on your mom. We'll come get you when we know more." Eli nodded numbly, watching as the doors to the treatment room closed behind his mother. He was left standing in the middle of the emergency room, feeling more alone than ever. The minutes dragged on like hours, and every second felt like a lifetime as Eli waited, his stomach tied in knots. He found a seat in the corner of the waiting room, pulling his knees up to his chest as he tried to stay calm. The cold, hard plastic of the chair felt uncomfortable beneath him, but he barely noticed. His mind was too busy racing through everything that had happened. The ambulance ride, the paramedics, the police officer's accusations, and now, the uncertainty of his mom's condition. Time seemed to blur together, but eventually the nurse returned, her face tired but kind. "Your mom is stable for now," she said, sitting down next to Eli. "She's going to be here for a while, but the doctors are taking care of her. She's in good hands." Relief washed over Eli like a wave, and for the first time in hours, he felt like he could breathe again. But the relief was fleeting. His mom was stable, but she wasn't out of the woods yet. "Can I see her?" Eli asked, his voice small. The nurse hesitated for a moment before nodding. "I'll take you to her, but just for a little while. She needs to rest." Eli followed the nurse down the long hallway, his heart pounding in his chest as they reached the room where his mom lay. The sight of her hooked up to machines, an oxygen mask covering her face, made his stomach twist with fear. But she was alive. That was what mattered. Eli sat beside her, taking her hand in his. It was still cold, but her breathing was steadier now. He sat in silence for a while, just listening to the sound of her breathing and the steady beeping of the heart monitor. Hours passed in a blur of uncertainty, and as Eli sat by his mother's bedside, he heard the faint sound of his phone buzzing. He pulled it out of his pocket, blinking in surprise when he saw a message from Jessica. It was short, but it made his heart skip a beat. "The video's everywhere now. People are talking about it. They're demanding answers." Eli stared at the message, barely able to process what it meant. The video they had recorded, the one showing his mom lying unconscious while the emergency services delayed responding, was spreading. People were paying attention. For a moment, he felt a flicker of hope. Maybe things were finally going to change. Maybe people would see what was happening and demand that something be done. Just as he finished reading the message, the door to his mom's room creaked open. Eli looked up to see Mrs. Johnson, one of their neighbors, stepping inside with a soft smile on her face. She was holding her phone in her hand, and Eli could tell from the look in her eyes that she had good news. "I wanted to check on you," Mrs. Johnson said, her voice gentle. "And I've got something to tell you, Eli. That video we posted? It's going viral." Eli blinked in surprise. "Viral?" Mrs. Johnson nodded, her smile growing. People are sharing it all over social media. The news outlets are picking it up, and folks are angry. They want to know why the ambulance took so long. Why your mom was left to suffer just because of where you live. Eli's heart raced as he processed her words. He had never imagined that the video would spread like this. He had just wanted someone to listen, someone to help his mom. But now it seemed like the whole city was listening. Mrs. Johnson continued, her eyes shining with determination. There are already calls for an investigation. People are demanding that the city explain why emergency services aren't responding properly to neighborhoods like ours. They want justice, Eli, and they're not going to stop until they get it. Eli's chest swelled with a mixture of relief, pride, and disbelief. He had felt so powerless just hours ago, but now, thanks to the video, people were finally standing up for his mom and for everyone else who had been ignored and mistreated. "Do you think they'll really change things?" Eli asked quietly, his voice filled with a mix of hope and doubt. Mrs. Johnson nodded firmly. "I think they'll have to, sweetheart. People aren't going to let this go." Over the next few days, the momentum continued to build. The video had sparked outrage, not just in Eli's neighborhood, but across the city. News outlets began covering the story, and activists organized protests outside the city hall, demanding accountability from the emergency services and the city officials responsible for the delays. Eli's phone buzzed constantly with updates from Jessica and the other neighbors. They sent him videos of the protests, crowds of people holding signs and chanting for justice, calling for changes to the way the city handled emergencies in poorer neighborhoods. Eli felt overwhelmed by the support. People he didn't even know were standing up for his mom, for him, and for everyone else in their community who had been treated unfairly. For the first time in his life, Eli felt like people were truly listening. They weren't just ignoring him or writing him off because of where he lived. They were fighting for him. But even as the protests grew, Eli couldn't shake the fear that it might not be enough. His mom was still in the hospital, and while her condition had stabilized, she hadn't woken up yet. The doctors said it was just a matter of time, but Eli couldn't help but worry that something might still go wrong. He spent most of his time at the hospital, sitting by his mom's bedside, holding her hand and waiting. Every time her fingers twitched or her eyelids fluttered, his heart would race with hope, but she still didn't wake. It was during one of those quiet moments, when the room was filled with nothing but the steady beeping of the heart monitor, that the door swung open again. This time it wasn't Mrs. Johnson or any of the neighbors. It was a man in a dark suit, his expression serious but not unkind. "Eli," the man said, stepping into the room. "I'm a city official. I wanted to speak with you." Eli blinked in surprise, his heart pounding in his chest. Is this about my mom?" The man nodded. "It is. I came to apologize on behalf of the city for the way you and your mother were treated. What happened to you should never have happened, and I'm here to tell you that we're taking steps to make sure it never happens again." Eli listened in stunned silence as the city official explained the steps the city was taking in response to the protests and the public outcry. The 911 operator who had dismissed Eli's calls was under investigation, as were the paramedics and the police officers who had treated his family with suspicion. The city had also launched a full review of its emergency response protocols, with plans to allocate more resources to underserved neighborhoods. "We've heard the voices of the community," the official said, his tone firm. "And we're committed to making changes. The way emergency services have been operating in certain parts of the city is unacceptable, and we're going to fix it." Eli's heart swelled with a mixture of relief and pride. The fight wasn't over, but this was a start. The city was finally taking responsibility for what had happened, and they were promising to make things right. The official gave Eli a small smile before leaving the room, and as the door closed behind him, Eli turned back to his mother, who was still resting peacefully. He took her hand in his once more, feeling the warmth of her skin against his palm. "We did it, Mom," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "They're finally listening." The city official's apology lingered in Eli's mind like a weight slowly lifting off his chest. It wasn't an instant fix, but it was a start. The hospital room, which had felt so suffocating before, now seemed just a little lighter. His mother was still unconscious, but the sound of the heart monitor's steady beeping reassured him. For the first time in days, Eli allowed himself to breathe. Just a little. But the relief didn't last long. 2 days after the city official's visit, there was a knock on the door of his mother's hospital room. Eli, who had barely left her side, looked up to see 2 familiar faces standing in the doorway. Officer Thomas and Officer Jordan. The police officers from the apartment that night. Eli's stomach sank. He had hoped they were done with all of this, that after everything, they would just let it go. But the cold, suspicious expressions on the officers' faces told him otherwise. "We need to ask you some more questions, Eli," Officer Thomas said, his tone firm. His eyes flicked briefly to Eli's mother, still unconscious, before settling back on the boy. Eli felt a surge of anger rise in his chest. They still didn't believe him. After everything that had happened, the protests, the investigations, they still thought there was something shady going on. He clenched his fists at his sides, but before he could say anything, Officer Jordan stepped forward, his voice slightly softer than his partner's. "We understand this has been a tough time for you," he said, "but we have to make sure everything's on the up and up. We need to confirm the details of your 911 calls, and we need to know why there was a delay in getting emergency services to your address." Eli's heart pounded in his chest, and his mind raced back to the lie he had told. The fake address from the wealthier neighborhood. He had done it out of desperation, but now, standing in front of the 2 officers, he was terrified that they would find out. And if they did, would they even care about why he had lied? Or would they use it as an excuse to dismiss everything he and his neighbors had fought for? "I already told you," Eli said, his voice trembling slightly. "My mom passed out. I called for help, but no one was coming. I had to do something." The officers exchanged a glance. Officer Thomas crossed his arms, his expression hard. "You know lying to emergency services is a serious offense, right?" he said, his voice low and almost menacing. "If you weren't telling the truth about where you were, that could have serious consequences." Eli's stomach twisted in knots. He knew the officers were trying to scare him, trying to find something to pin on him, but he wasn't going to let them win. Not after everything. "I didn't have a choice," Eli snapped, his voice rising in anger. "I told them where we really lived and they wouldn't come. They didn't care because we live on the east side. I had to lie to get them to help my mom. What else was I supposed to do?" For a moment, the room fell into tense silence. Officer Jordan shifted uncomfortably, glancing at his partner, as if uncertain whether to press the issue further. Officer Thomas, however, remained stone-faced, his cold gaze fixed on Eli. "You understand that breaking the law, even for a good reason, can have consequences," Officer Thomas said, his voice hard and unwavering. "You lied to emergency services, and that's something we're going to have to investigate." Eli's heart pounded in his chest, the fear of what might happen next nearly overwhelming him. But before either officer could say another word, the door to the room swung open and Mr. Anderson stepped inside, his face set in a determined expression. "What's going on here?" Mr. Anderson asked, his voice calm but firm as he stood between Eli and the officers. "This boy has been through enough. Why are you harassing him?" Officer Thomas raised an eyebrow, clearly unimpressed by the interruption. "We're following up on some inconsistencies with the 911 calls," he said. "This is standard procedure." Mr. Anderson crossed his arms over his chest, his eyes narrowing. "Standard procedure or not, this kid doesn't need any more stress. His mom is in a coma, and he's been fighting to get her help. You should be investigating why it took so long for the ambulance to arrive, not trying to blame him for doing what he had to do." The tension in the room grew thicker as Officer Thomas and Mr. Anderson locked eyes, neither willing to back down. Officer Jordan shifted uncomfortably beside his partner, clearly torn between doing his job and acknowledging the point Mr. Anderson had made. After a long moment, Officer Thomas let out a slow breath, clearly frustrated. "We'll be in touch," he said, his voice tight. "But this isn't over." With that, the officers turned and left the room, leaving Eli and Mr. Anderson standing in the thick silence that followed. Eli's legs felt weak beneath him, and he sank back into the chair beside his mother's bed. His hands were still shaking, but he tried to focus on breathing, on calming down. "Mr. Anderson knelt beside him, placing a reassuring hand on Eli's shoulder. "Don't let them scare you, kid," he said softly. "You did the right thing." Eli nodded, but the fear still gnawed at him. Even though the community was rallying behind them, even though the protests were growing, it felt like the system was still trying to fight back, trying to find a way to discredit everything they had fought for. The next few days passed in a blur of protests, media coverage, and mounting pressure on the city. The video continued to spread, and more people joined the calls for an investigation into the emergency services handling of the situation. Local news stations aired segments about Eli's story, interviewing neighbors and activists who had been involved in the protests. One evening, as Eli sat by his mother's bedside, Mrs. Johnson arrived at the hospital with a group of reporters. They had been following the story closely, and now they wanted to interview Eli on camera. At first, Eli wasn't sure if he was ready for that kind of attention. He had never liked being the center of attention, and the idea of speaking in front of so many people made him nervous. But Mrs. Johnson reassured him, her kind smile giving him the courage he needed. "People need to hear your voice, Eli," she said gently. "You've done something incredible. You've made the whole city pay attention, and now you have a chance to make sure they don't forget." Eli swallowed hard, his heart pounding in his chest as the reporters set up their cameras and microphones. They asked him about his mom, about the night he called 911, and about how it felt to have the entire city rally behind him. Eli spoke softly but clearly, his words filled with emotion as he described the fear he had felt, the frustration of being ignored, and the desperation that had driven him to lie to the emergency services just to get help. "I didn't want to lie," Eli said, his voice shaking slightly. "But they weren't coming, and my mom needed help. I was scared. I didn't know what else to do." The reporter nodded sympathetically, her expression serious as she listened to Eli's story. "Do you think things are going to change now?" she asked. "Do you think the city will take action?" Eli hesitated for a moment before answering. "I hope so," he said quietly. "People shouldn't have to fight this hard just to get help. My mom, she's not just someone from a poor neighborhood. She's a good person, and everyone deserves to be treated like they matter." The interview was over quickly, but the impact was immediate. That night, the story aired on every local news station, and social media exploded with support for Eli and his mom. People from all over the city, and even from other parts of the country, began to send messages of encouragement and solidarity. The protests grew larger, with more and more people demanding that the city take responsibility for the systemic failures in its emergency services. Activists organized rallies outside the mayor's office, calling for justice, not just for Eli's mom, but for everyone in the community who had been mistreated or ignored by the system. A week after the protests had begun, Eli received a call from Mrs. Johnson, who sounded more excited than he had ever heard her. "Eli," she said, her voice breathless with excitement. "The city's agreed to a full investigation. They're going to review the entire emergency response system, and they've already suspended the 911 operator who didn't take your call seriously." Eli's heart skipped a beat. It was finally happening.